Tonight is the 9th installation of the Civility series in America, and it is a series that was created by the City of Stamford and Bob Dylan Schneider of the Dylan Schneider Group, sponsored by Purdue Pharma, Sacred Heart University, the Hearst Media Group, and our host tonight, the Ferguson Library. And all of those organizations believe in what I believe and what Bob Dylan Schneider believes is our commitment to restoring civility in America. Tonight's discussion will focus on the theme of civility in history, and I had a brief chat a few minutes ago. I think you're going to find the topic extremely interesting and focused on where we are today based on where we were in history. I look forward to this particular session because, as you know, or many of you know, I am a fan of history. My family is fans of history. We were brought up with history in mind. And history, to me, is a classroom where we turn for a perspective not only on where we are today, but where we're going in the future. History always provides examples of incredible individuals, one of whom you will hear about tonight. And it teaches us how people were engaged, how their different philosophies developed, how they were able to move forward in life and be successful, be memorable, provide a commitment to society, and be known forever in the annals of history. This Memorial Day, we will be honoring in the city of Stamford someone of that caliber, a Stamford native, who was awarded the U.S. Congressional Medal of Honor for valor in his actions during World War II. He also received the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, and 10 other decorations, which made him one of the most decorated soldiers of all time. Yet, he was a very humble man, a man of great character and civility, and he made it a point never to mention these awards to anyone. In fact, it was his niece who learned about it well after World War II ended, and she had to draw from him every single ounce of information that we know about today. To this day, we don't know where his medals are, but this Memorial Day, we will be honoring him by unveiling a statue. The word that I use is formal politeness, is how this man conducted himself throughout his affairs in the city of Stamford. And formal politeness is synonymous with civility. Our distinguished speaker tonight, Amity Schlaes, we are honored to have. She has encountered many similar stories in history of individuals who leveraged civility to make the world a better place. She knows more about it than most people. She's going to share some of it with us tonight, and we'll be able to take these stories of leadership and exceptionalism in our history to help us move closer to civility in today's world. It gives me great pleasure at this time to introduce Bob Dylan Schneider, who will introduce our guest speaker. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Because of Mayor Pavia, and I got to tell you, when I think about the city of Stamford going forward and the fact that he's not going to be here in the future, I have a real point of anxiety, but because he's done such a good job and he's such a fine man. I heard, by the way, today from UBS that they may well move 500 jobs into Stamford, which I think, again, is tribute to the mayor and the climate he set here and the difference he's made. And 500 jobs in Stamford is a huge statement, and I hope that happens for the city. But because of the mayor, we've had people here like Jim Kuno, who runs the Getty Trust on the West Coast. And Jim Kuno is going to be asked to oversee all of the arts, architecture, painting, drawing, music, all of the arts for the World Economic Forum on a global basis. That's the kind of person that Mayor Pavia has brought here. We've had people like Ernie Anastas, who's won more awards than there are walls to put them on, and who is, as you know, one of the leading anchormen in New York City. We've had Olympia Snowe, who has left the Senate and who's trying to figure out what the future is like and what it should bring. We've had Georgette Mosbacher, who is one of the top figures in the Republican Party here in the United States. We've had Ed Riley, who runs the American Management Association, Joel Klein, the former head of the New York City school system, Bill Bratton, who ran the police force in New York and Los Angeles, Boston, Alan Goodman, who runs the Institute for International Education, which oversees the Fulbright scholarships and is the largest educational exchange program in the world. Outstanding people. And tonight we're going to have Amity Schlaes. On June 11th, we'll have Fay Vincent. And Fay Vincent, as you know, is the commissioner of Major League Baseball. And Fay Vincent has a lot to say about sports and Major League Baseball. And on June 17th, we'll have Texas Governor Rick Perry. And we just got a confirmation that Rick Perry is going to be with us. He will be a factor in the next presidential election in at least two ways. One is the Hispanic vote, which is a huge vote in this country, is rooted in Texas. And Rick Perry has a definite view on the Hispanic vote and will share that with us. The second is Texas, obviously, is an important state, and a lot of the policy and direction and ideas that are going to form the race in 3 years are going to come out of Rick Perry's camp. So it should be two good, robust talks, and I hope that you'll have the chance to be here for them. Amity Schlaes, what an extraordinary person. Amity Schlaes is a syndicated columnist. She is the head of the George W. Bush Institute for Economic Growth. She has just authored a book called Coolidge, which is about America's 30th president. She has 3 previous books. She teaches in the economic history program of MBA program at the Stern School. She has written for the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. She's been a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. She's written for Forbes, the New Yorker, Fortune, the National Review, and the New Republic, and that's a trick, by the way, and Foreign Affairs. She's appeared on The Daily Show. She's on television on a regular basis. This is a person of enormous caliber. But what Amity Schlaes really is a true intellect. We are very fortunate to have one of her caliber. One of the things that everybody talks about that is going to be very important in terms of the next election, not is Chris Christie going to run or is Hillary Clinton going to run, it's what are the ideas that are going to really shape the next generation of America. Amity Schlaes is one of those people who is called on to develop and think about and shape those ideas. And we're very fortunate to have a person of her caliber here tonight. Amity, thank you very much for coming.
What a kind introduction. I'm very touched. Before I reintroduce, I want to tell you 2 stories about Coolidge. This is his picture. He didn't usually smile. This is the best he could do. Can you see that he doesn't show teeth? It's a limited smile, but a cute one, okay. The first involves a dinner party in Washington. A lady is very eager to be a good table partner with I think he was Vice President Coolidge at that time, and she heard that Coolidge is silent, and his nickname is Silent Cal. So she's kind of a socialite show-off. And so she's seated right next to him, and she says in a very loud voice, "I bet all the others I could get you to say more than 2 words tonight." And he said, "You lose." And the second story, I hope you listen carefully as I tell it. I was listening to the mayor speak before, and we all have, he's a wonderful way of speaking. Each era has a pacing of the way we speak, and they spoke more slowly in the 20s. So this is slightly slow. Unfortunately, it's a lady again who's in the mendicant position. It was a lady who went to see President Coolidge to talk about a job candidate she had she wanted a friend of hers to go be ambassador to England, and she wanted it really badly. And President Coolidge, she can tell that he doesn't really like her talking too much, so she just keeps talking and talking and talking, and laying out all the advantages of this ambassador candidate. He's nice. He's worked in the United Kingdom before. He knows all about history. He's a good diplomat. And finally, she gets all desperate, and she says, "But I'm sure you are aware of the merits of my candidate," before I even showed up at the White House. And President Coolidge said, "Yes, less now." So maybe Coolidge was very uncivil. Not nice, right? Rude. A man who, as yet another lady, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the daughter of President Roosevelt Theodore, said he looked as though he'd been weaned on a pickle. So why am I here? What brings him here? This is supposed to be about civility. I think the answer is because civility is complicated. This invitation was very special to me because I, like this audience, have been thinking a lot about civility. There's a surface civility that is necessary, how we treat one another in meetings, at that first interaction, in our discourse, of course, how we appear on TV, right? It floats over to that. That we tell people to be nice. We tell our children to be nice, and then to be liked. But of course, there's more to civility than that. There must be, after all, if there weren't more to civility than being nice and being liked first time and polite and all that, this would be Mr. Dylan Schneider's series on etiquette in America. And you would just have Emily Post, right? Or you would just have, but there is something more to civility than just being nice the first time. The second kind of civility, maybe engendered by the first time, by the first kind, is what we can call trust in one another, trust in society, whether you trust someone because he was civil or to be civil to you in future, to give you a fair chance, or whether you can trust a counterparty in a business arrangement to do what he or she said they would do, or a political trust you want to set aside just for the sake of this meeting, whether we approve of what a politician has up for a plan. We all have different views, and just ask, does the politician do what he said as best he can, right? Or she said as best she can, and how can we help the politician to be a good partner to the people, or his legislature and he, or her legislature and she, right? So today I'm going to tell you a story about these nuances of civility with the brief, perhaps rude president as part of it. It's a story actually of two presidents. The first one is Mr. Coolidge's predecessor, who was Warren G. Harding. You know, President Harding served from 1921 to 1923 when he unfortunately died. And then his vice president was Calvin Coolidge, who then served from 23 to 29. It's a story that involves law, politics, and also definitely civility. And again, I want to say I'm grateful to you for having me, everyone. The library, Mr. DiMattia, all of you, Mayor Pavia, tonight. Okay, so this story starts in the early 20s, a kind of turbulent moment in American history. And I noticed when I was researching the Coolidge book and went back to the 1920s, just the way you're going to be able to do at this library when you start to search the old newspapers and the computers, that there were a number of aspects of the 1920s that were similar to our economy and our society today. We have some political demonstrations. You think of Occupy Wall Street, for example. They had much larger political demonstrations, much larger unrest, whole cities shut down, such as Seattle and at one moment Boston. We just recently had a very sad bombing in Boston. They had a bombing of Wall Street in that period that frightened the country quite badly, and other acts of terror. The policy was uncertain. They just had a crisis. In that instance, it was the war. In the war, the federal government shut down one of the main industries, which was railroad, and nationalized it. And then it denationalized it. That's very confusing in the economy. The stock market was also shut down in World War I. So there's a lot of confusion. Different groups are seeking more from government, but the debt is already way up from before. Today we talk about trillions, and we get all shaky. Then they were talking about changes in billions, right? Maybe the debt had been 1 or 2 billion, and all of a sudden it was 27 or 28 billion, and that sort of vertigo that you have when amount goes up that much. So if you just drop the consonants and drop the B and drop the TR, we call that an illions moment. When you're very, very dizzy at the high number you're hearing, so many illions. And of course, the deficit had broadened a lot during the war, and that was a lot of illions all of a sudden too, where it never had been before, and everyone wondered what the future was. And yet people were seeking more. I'm going to single out 2 groups. One were the farmers who were seeing prices going down. They wanted some sort of regular payment from Washington, which was then a new idea, a regular system of payment anyway, of subsidy and funding. And they were losing their farms. They had a compelling case. And there was another group who were the veterans, and there were a lot of veterans then. You'll want to remember there was universal conscription in World War I. There were terrible battles, and there was no penicillin. So 1/3 of the vets came back disabled, and he might not ever get better. And of course, his wife would never work. This is back then. And what did the vets want? They wanted a big or even a small pension payment, what was called a bonus from the federal government for when they were old. That sounds reasonable too. But the winning party in the 1920 election, in that case, the Republicans took a position. They said the government grew enough in World War I. Maybe our interest rates will go up. All this discussion, maybe we should try and make the government more like it was before the war. That was their goal. They talked about common sense, regular lives, getting along. They talked about civility, and they talked about normalcy was the word they used. Let's have normalcy. So we're going to be cautious about spending and try to cut back the illions. And when we teach this word normalcy, we think about what we learn in like AP history books and so on. It's usually kind of the normalcy, it sounds like it's for duds, right? They're stupid if you're normal, right? It sounds like everyone has to be a cog, but they didn't mean that at all. I discovered they meant a normal environment so we could be creative and have fun. Coolidge didn't like the word normalcy. He was very picky about his English. He said less economic uncertainty, which is a very familiar phrase we hear today. I want everything to be calmer. So they promised to cut back government. That's what they campaigned on. Normalcy conveniently started with the letters N-O. No, we're going to cut back, and maybe there'll be jobs then, maybe they won't. We could debate that, but that was their hypothesis, and the war will pass. Yet, that said, these 2 candidates, Warren Harding, a senator from Ohio, and Calvin Coolidge, a New Englander, a governor of Massachusetts, are very different kinds of guys. Harding warmed the hearts of others. If he were here, you would like him. He talked a lot. He had a great taste for alliteration, so he'd say big and beautiful like that. Or he was very careful about using long words. He even used a word to describe his own rhetoric. He said he bloviated, and that's where that word. And there were rolling sentences like waves in the bay of good feeling coming at you from him. I don't have a picture of him here, and I should, but it's the evening. We don't need pictures. You can imagine he had these startling eyebrows, and he was said to be very good looking. I'm not sure I can see that, but anyway, that in the period he was considered extremely good looking, and that was regarded as important because this was the first time women had the vote in 1920. He was certainly much loved by his Senate brethren. He was kind of a Western gentleman. He could chew a little bit of tobacco. He could smoke a little bit. He was pretty good at golf. He could drink, but not too much, and always the other guys had fun with him. He had 2 cabinets, his poker cabinet and his golf cabinet, which had different groups he hung out with. And that was regarded as important because he could get along, so he could make things happen. He was a guy's guy. And then you had Coolidge, this governor from Massachusetts, was very quiet, didn't like to talk. They called him a well of silence. And in Washington, they don't like silence. A small town attorney, pretty good at contracts. extremely taciturn. I'll tell you one more story. When he was a very young attorney, just maybe not even past the bar yet in Massachusetts, there was a case where someone died on a lake in a rowboat. And the question was whether you could move the late person from one place to another, from one town to another, and there were all sorts of complicating municipal rules. And the man the man who was rowing the boat, all upset because the other man had died, burst into the law office of Hammond and Field, where Coolidge was reading the law, young man, and explained this. And Coolidge, without looking up, said, "Can move body." And the client went to the big grown-up lawyers and said, "Well, what does he mean, can move body? Is that right? Is it true?" And the older lawyer said, "He's young and new, but we find when he says something, it's usually accurate." And then you would ask, why did he say it so short, and why wasn't he nice, and the death and all? Where was that? And well, one reason was, and this was part of Coolidge's career, he always spoke short because lawyers charge by the word or hour, and the shorter you talk, the less your poor client has to pay. And so if you work hard, you don't have to fudge. You can give a precise, categoric answer, and then they might trust you. Right? Because and then they might come back. That's very early Coolidge, and people knew that. But a small town lawyer, that's not really very Washington, is it? He wasn't in the Washington Speakers Bureau or anything like that, right? So this pair won. The big, chatty Harding and the quiet, sandy New England Coolidge. And there they were. And Harding set out as president to do what he promised, bring normalcy, follow his policies, cut back government. He did that. He promised to pass a law. Right now we have a problem with figuring out how to budget. That would give the executive more power over the budget. That would create the modern Office of Management and Budget. And if you've read David Stockman, you've seen that name has been in the news lately. David Stockman is head of the OMB. That was the office that Harding created by passing this law. And it gave the executive a research staff, the chief executive, so he could talk to the government departments and say, spend less. It was hard to pass the law because it was wrenching power from Congress, from senators, and Harding, using his good humor, his lovability, went down to the Senate floor and begged his brethren to pass this law, and they did, and he signed it. And that did help succeeding presidents from both parties to control the budget. Second, he cut taxes. The taxes coming out of World War I were in the 70s, the top rates. He cut them down into the 50s. He did what he said. And he had some worthy privatization projects. This is, remember, coming out of a war, and the government had all this oil it didn't know what to do with, all these reserves. And he got started on that. He cut a very careful, thoughtful deal with the veterans. He really didn't want to create what we would call an entitlement. But he did spend many millions, if not billions, in a law that created a Veterans Bureau that would give hospitals. And that was a good compromise, and hard for both sides, worked on very hard, promised a lot. But Harding was a complicated man. His lovability kind of got in the way after a point. His brain might say, I want to say no, and I promised the people I would say no, and I would do this. And his plan might say no, but his heart said yes. He's a very friendly, likable guy. He didn't like to veto. It was mean. So he only vetoed 6 times. He didn't like to cut taxes. It was hard to cut the rate. So he got tired and he stopped at 58%. That was what he got the taxes down to. He didn't like to live pure very much. Remember, this is a period of prohibition, the 20s. And if you're going to be cutting the government, you have to live like a model, right? Because you're telling other people to do without, right? And he used to party quite a bit at the White House. Miss Roosevelt Longworth noticed that people went to the White House for food and action. What's that? Oh my God, that's very interesting, right? And he got some cover because his best friend was the owner of the Washington Post, Mr. McLean. I told you he was popular. But people began to know that he was not living as he told others to live. And they noticed, much more important, that he appointed his friends to these jobs. These important jobs. So, for example, the Worthy Energy privatization project out west, all this extra oil the Navy had and so on, it sounded nice. The people would get money. It would reduce the debt if he would privatize. But he gave all the contracts, basically, or the contracts were given that to his friends. And instead of a worthy privatization project, it became Teapot Dome. Scandal on the White House, selling the people's oil to your friends, Mr. President. And the second was even worse with the poor veterans. He appointed a friend, Mr. Forbes, to run the hospitals, and Mr. Forbes took enormous kickbacks, hundreds of thousands in their dollars on these little hospitals, and the poor veterans didn't get the hospitals they deserved. And Mr. Forbes went to Leavenworth and to the prison, right? And that was terrible, terrible in all kinds of ways. Terrible if you don't think that veterans should get entitlements, because certainly they deserve a check if all the government is going to do with the money for them is take it in some piggy illegal, right, kickback, bribery way. So Harding kind of wiped out in terms of his goal versus what he said he would do. And he was a very lovable guy, and he knew that he wiped out, and he was funny about it. I told you he was likable. So he said, I can take care of my enemies in a fight, but my friends, my GD friends, they keep me walking the floor at night. All his friends betrayed him and were corrupt. And I would tell a joke. I don't know if it's civil. But I'll tell you a joke about Harding that his father told, and it was a 1920s kind of joke, and you can tell it to grown-ups. You can't tell it to teens because they don't know the words. But his father said, it was a good thing Warren wasn't a girl, President Harding, because if he were a girl, he'd always be in the family way. And you tell your kids that and see what they know, if they know what that means. So this is going on. He doesn't complete, right? And as you know, President Harding unfortunately kind of died of this inconsistency. He had basically a stroke-like event and died. And you have enter the vice president, Coolidge, an entirely different type. Not much expected of him. You're all very smart people. So you know you're sitting there. It was August 1923 when Harding died and Coolidge came in. And you're sitting there counting the months. And how many months till the election? 24. Well, it's 12, 14 months, not very long, maybe 15 months. Lame duck, right? That's what you're thinking, because all politically sophisticated people just, well, lame duck, right? And Coolidge was indeed mocked when he came in, this quiet Massachusetts governor. They called him the accident of an accident, because some people didn't like Harding either, right? He was clearly odd. Washington is all about saying yes and being friends, and Charles Evans Hughes, a very senior politician, a statesman, went to see Coolidge when he became president. He didn't have a big party, when he was sworn. He was sworn in by his father. His father was a notary, getting back to the small town in the contract, by kerosene light in his house. Very dramatic. And when he sat in the White House back in Washington, he waited very politely for Mrs. Harding to vacate, and she took a while. Had to wait, respect, right? So he went in, and Charles Evans Hughes comes along and sees President Coolidge, and he said, what a difference. When you went to see Harding, there were 5 people all around him, and usually they were smoking, having a great time, and making deals, and making stuff happen, right? It was like, I don't know what, Mad Men, right? And he went to see Coolidge, and with Coolidge, the cigar was there, and President Coolidge was there, but nobody else except for maybe his faithful friend, Mr. Stearns, the department store head. Coolidge was alone, and when you went to see Coolidge, he stayed alone, and when you left the office, the answer was usually no, which is unusual for a politician. Hughes noticed that. And Coolidge was, where Harding was a divided man, Coolidge was a united man. His plan said no, his party said no, and his own heart said no. I mean, he was a cutter by temperament. He was like an accountant. If you would take one of those career tests, you could see he would come up as a lawyer or accountant. And he vowed to execute political trust, what Harding had promised to do, what they had promised to do, to perfection. He wrote that in a letter to the owner of the Washington Post. That's a big vow, and in that he resembles a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson. Right? Lyndon Johnson executed, this is the anniversary year, an important year for President Kennedy of his death. Johnson vowed to execute what Kennedy had promised to perfection, and Coolidge is that way to Harding. I will do what my boss started, and I will do that to honor his commitment and his memory. You may wonder how Coolidge did this. For this book, we were talking earlier about the exciting possible digitization of some of your local newspapers. Here, I did digitize for the work of this book the personal calendar of the president, and we quantified the amount of times Coolidge met with his budget director, and it was a lot, like 50 times a week. 50 times a year, every week. And that's hard to do. Other presidents don't do that very easily. He would always meet with the budget director before he met with the cabinet. Why? Because it's very easy to say yes when you're unprepared, right, as a boss, but it's hard to say no. You have to know why you're saying no. So he would work very hard to be ready. An incredible budget discipline. He used that law. He vetoed a lot. So I told you Harding vetoed 5 or 6 times. Coolidge vetoed 50 times. That's tough. People come at you with laws that are crafted to make you love them and love the law, such as Coolidge liked to fish. Of course, there were fishing bills all the time, right? He vetoed them. Every politician by temperament has his favorite legislative device, and Coolidge, being silent Cal, liked the pocket veto. Because with the pocket veto, you don't have to write a message. You can just veto it. And the other amazing thing about the pocket veto is the poor lawmakers have to start all over and pass a new law. They can't override you very easily. But it requires some art. You sort of have to trick those lawmakers into passing the law just before the recess and then put it in your pocket, veto it during the recess. Coolidge was a regular Isaac Stern, a maestro of the pocket veto. And he did that to hold the spending back. The farmers came to him, and he was a farmer. You know, his father had a cheese factory, which is a kind of exercise in desperation. Cheese factory. What is that? It's when you don't have refrigeration or a train, and you have to get the cheese to town, and you want it to be not so perishable. He came from a very poor farming area, and the farmers came and said, we'd like a subsidy, and he said, well, farmers never have made much money. Don't suppose they ever will. Don't suppose there's much we can do about it. That sounds awfully mean, right? Whew, I'm telling you that, it gives me a shiver, but there it is. He looked at things realistically. Vis-a-vis taxes, and this is hard to imagine because I told you he didn't talk, and his Treasury Secretary, Henry Mellon, didn't talk very much. They did cut rates a lot, down to 25%. You wonder how they did it in this campaign if they never talked. It was said that Mellon and Coolidge conversed in pauses. Two silent men, right? They delivered on the promise, and Coolidge delivered on the budget cut promise. The budget actually came down. If you want to know one thing about Coolidge, is that he said he would cut the budget, and when he left office after all those months, 66, 67 months, the budget was actually lower than when he came in, even though the population had grown, the economy had grown 4% sometimes. Lots of things had happened. And this is not relative to inflation or anything, or GDP or potential GDP or population. He actually cut the federal budget in a time of prosperity and peace, which is hard to do. Of course, he cut the debt as well. Was he popular for this? Not necessarily among the Washingtonians. We all covet time with the executive. I described that before. We all know we're just dying to get him with an executive, especially a president. It's sort of like the MasterCard commercial, right? Meeting with the president on Capitol Hill, good. Letter from the president, good. Actual opportunity to sit with the president at his house, priceless, right? You really want that. And what's curious about Coolidge is he did offer politicians an opportunity, lawmakers, to come and eat at the White House and have some of his Vermont maple syrup from his own farm, saving again, right? And curiously, because he said no so often, perhaps they didn't say yes. They didn't take that priceless opportunity. And one of the ushers at the White House actually kept the negative RSVPs sort of out of spite. All the reasons people gave not to accept a president's offer to eat breakfast with him. So I'll read them to you because they're kind of hilarious. Senator Heflin, will you come to breakfast? Regrets, sick. Sarah Pittman, will you come to breakfast? That comes back with the paper. Regrets, sick. Senator Norris, that's a progressive, so he wouldn't agree at all with President Coolidge, who is more conservative, unable to locate. Senator Reid, the one from Missouri, regrets, comma, sick friend. Very lame excuse. But all this cutting of Coolidge made him very popular with the people. That's one thing that's worth noting. In 1924, I told you he was sort of expected to be a lame duck and all. The Hardings hadn't particularly liked him at the end. And we had a third party running, sort of like Ross Perot, that was the Progressives, and they actually got 17% of the vote, but Coolidge took an absolute majority in 1924 with his no and his cutting program, which is more than the Democrats and the Progressives combined. Very unusual for a negative campaigner, the great refrainer, as we call him in the book. And in 1928, Coolidge chose not to run, partly because he thought office corrupted after a time, that maybe you shouldn't serve forever. The Republican Party, which is a very neurotic animal now, as then was quite neurotic, and it had a nervous breakdown because it knew that it could win best with Coolidge if he would run again. And Mr. Hoover, who did run for president in Coolidge's stead, swore that he would uphold Coolidge policy, which he didn't, but that's another story. If you go look, so he was politically popular, and the outcomes for his plan weren't bad. I looked very intensely at the economy of the 20s. The crash was bad, but the economy was good. We can talk about that later. And what I did notice that so relates to you is his brand of civility, which wasn't polite hour to hour, built political trust. So people liked the government better and were more willing to do things for it. And that served those who needed to take big necessary steps following him, even President Roosevelt. That they thought the federal government was okay because it kind of did what it said it would, even if you didn't always like that thing. And what we have now is this big division where people can never agree and none of us trust the government. So that's interesting that someone from a party you might be with or you might disagree with would nonetheless build trust for all of us. So whoever comes in next, who might have the opposite position, benefits from that and the people as well. Very interesting. I mean, if you go back and listen to the Cole Porter song, "You're the Top," there's some lines in it, "You're the top, you're like a Coolidge dollar." And that song was in the middle of the Depression when you're supposed to hate the predecessors of Roosevelt, right? But still Coolidge enjoyed, even into the 30s, a lot of trust from the people because of his willingness to deliver more even than he promised. I'm going to thank you for this time, and no, in the question time, we'll also get into the economics. And if you ask, did Coolidge cause the Depression? Of course I'll answer, but I'll say now for a moment, no. Very monosyllabically, like Coolidge, no, and no, he didn't. And in this speech about saying no, at the very end, I'm going to reverse it. And if you ask whether saying no and being short can be civil and civic, this time I'm going to say yes, I do think it can be. Thank you very much.
Do you think that a candidate with Coolidge's idiosyncrasies could be elected president in the era of mass media and the blogosphere?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. P., for that question. Could we have a candidate who is quiet today be elected and who grew on you rather than charming you the first time only? Yes, and one reason I think that is recently, because of the time frame of this book, it's been out a couple months, and in that time frame, Mrs. Thatcher died. And so we had a chance to think over about the 70s. And if you went back to the UK in the early 70s and to the Tory party, her party, they would be the party of getting liked, of compassionate conservatism, right? And you would never imagine, if you had interviewed the Tory leaders in the 70s, that a tough old iron lady would become the leader of their party, that they would let it happen or that the voters would let it happen. But when they had trouble in inflation and so on in the UK, voters began to look for someone a little tougher and maybe someone consistent. You can see that now a little bit, and suddenly Mrs. Thatcher seemed attractive, and she became the head of the party, and she was elected, and. So I think it has to do also with the moment, rather than the blogosphere, it also has to do with the economic moment. Right now, our interest rates are really low. It's as though we're anesthetized, right? And the unemployment is where it should be, but the interest rates are very low. If the interest rates go up to 10%, and there are plenty of people in this room who remember 19%, even for houses, the country will be all aware, or if the US credit rating goes down, which it might, a few more notches, that we might need someone tough of either party. It could be a Democrat too. So I think it's not the blogosphere so much as the kind of lulling of the interest rate, actually.
I wonder if you would not leave us where you did with regard to his presidency and take us beyond that. What happened to him afterwards, and what kind of life did he lead from that standpoint?
So I'll talk about him and not the economy.
Right.
What happened to him? Coolidge was a sourpuss. I mean, he was a shady personality. I don't mean shady crooked, I mean shady a bit dark. And as you'll find out in the book, he, like Lincoln, lost a son in the White House. His son died very quickly because there was no penicillin. He had a blister from playing tennis on the White House court. And he died in 6 or 7 days. In fact, at the Democratic National Convention, it was in 24, the news came to, I think it was Chairman Walsh, the man who was running the convention, which was a bumptious one at Madison Square Garden. And they were at the 74th ballot. And then the chairman gets this paper where he learns that Calvin Jr. died, who was 16. And the Times wrote a beautiful but heartrending editorial. He said the whole hall, which had been loud the whole time the Democrats were fighting, went silent. And then a moan went through the hall because everyone shared the president's grief, all the politicians at the convention, and that the president's grief, their troubles had always been the president's, whatever party, and now the president's troubles were theirs. So I think that that was a shadow for them, although as with Lincoln, I argue Coolidge persevered. He wasn't incapacitated in terms of policy because of the death of his son. It was a shadow. And when the Coolidges came out from the presidency, they went home to Northampton. They didn't quite know what to do. President Coolidge wrote a column which was enormously popular, so popular it was embarrassing. He was in hundreds of newspapers. And he was a bit anxious about his popularity in a way. And he did something so special. All his important friends, Mr. Dillon Schneiders of his life, got together and they raised money for the Coolidge Library. Because he had stuff, and we didn't have like I work for President Bush's library complex now, and the government gives some money, and the friends give some money together, they make, right? They didn't have a law like that then, so it was all up to the friends, right? And they got together, led by Clarence Barron, after whom Barron's is named, and who owned the Wall Street Journal at that time, and they raised $2 million, imagine that, for President Coolidge's stuff. And all along, President Coolidge kept telling them, this is for my wife, but I don't think they believed him. They thought it was going to be for President Coolidge's stuff, right? And lo and behold, President Coolidge meant it, and he took all the money his friends raised, every penny, and gave it to Grace, his wife's favorite charity, the Clark School for the Deaf in Northampton, Massachusetts. And what a marital gift. That's very interesting. And that was because she loved her school for the deaf. She was actually a teacher of the deaf, as quiet as he was. She was an extrovert. It was a marriage like that. And she trained as a young teacher. When he first met her, she was teaching kids how to speak. And he knew that she was very healthy. She was the first aerobic first lady, I'd say. She would march miles and miles in Rock Creek Park with all the servicemen following her. And he kind of had a questionable heart. They didn't have angiograms then, but he kind of knew something wasn't right, and he might go. And he knew that she had decades ahead of her, and he wanted her to do something good, to enjoy doing it, and to be the most important lady in the town. And she was, because of that special gift. It was too bad for the papers. But it was what an act of love. And all the time you see Coolidge doing these quiet things for people. They're not always evident. So he did die, unfortunately, pretty soon, just about 60 years old in 1933, even as President Roosevelt became president.
That was a great job, Amity. Thank you very much for putting civility and history in perspective for us all.